Since the 9/11 attacks in the US, the Abu Qatada case has come to be at the heart of the battle between the UK security services and human rights lawyers and campaigners. Based on MI5 intelligence, the government says he poses a threat to this country's security. But human rights campaigners say the 6-year detention of Abu Qatada in Britain is unprecedented and contrary to a fair judicial process. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Absent Justice with me, Moazzam Begg. For years, Abu Qatada has been described by politicians and the press as a very dangerous individual who has links to Al Qaeda. But despite the allegation against Abu Qatada, he's never been charged in the UK with any criminal offence, terrorism or otherwise. Under a highly secretive judicial system based on intelligence as opposed to evidence, Abu Qatada has spent almost a decade either in prison or under house arrest and control orders. The Special Immigration Appeals Commission, or SIAC as it's known, is now considering applications to release him on bail and to have his detention declared unlawful. Last month, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that sending him back to his native Jordan to face a trial based on torture-tainted evidence would be unlawful. So, if Abu Qatada is as dangerous as the government and SIAC say he is, then why release him at all? Well, we'll be discussing this question and more in a few minutes. But first, here's a report from Houria Al-Haddad.
10 years ago, Abu Qatada became one of Britain's most wanted men. British authorities have suspected him of involvement in terror-related activities, but have never produced enough evidence to place him on trial in the UK. So instead, authorities have sought to deport him to face trial in Jordan. Abu Qatada denies any link to Al Qaeda or terrorism, and says he faces torture if sent back to his homeland, where he's already been convicted of terrorism in absentia. His case has gone before several courts. Back in 2007, Abu Qatada was defeated at the Special Immigration Appeals Commission. It was a major victory for the government's strategy of finding ways of deporting terrorism suspects, who it says it cannot put on trial in the UK. The Jordanian has largely remained in prison or on a control order, and he's continually challenged the legal efforts to remove him from the UK. This latest victory is significant, and now British authorities must decide what their next step will be.
Well, joining me in the studio to discuss this question and many more is Victoria Brittain, a journalist and author. Victoria, the case of Abu Qatada is something that you've been following since the outset. He's been described by a senior judge in Europe as Al Qaeda's representative and ambassador in Europe and the right-hand man of Osama bin Laden. How do you think that statements like this could have come about to begin with?
Well, it's very clear that the judge in question was making a political point with this, and the whole Abu Qatada case is riddled with these cliches. How many million times have you read that he's the right-hand man in Europe?
Or indeed, how many right-hand men did Osama bin Laden have?
None of us know. One judge said that, and it's now become, in everybody's cuttings book or computer, it's the one description of him that comes up all the time. But I think that the key thing that we have to think about is, here is a person who was allowed into this country and given refugee status. And that is a process. It's looked at and you're not lightly given refugee status. So that happened. Then the world changed with 9/11 and Britain and America declared that everything had changed as far as Muslims were concerned, and a group of men, which in the end included him, got put in prison in Belmarsh without any trial, and they were to be deported or held here indefinitely. Now, as was said in the introduction, Abu Qatada has never been charged with any case of any sort in Britain. We have a plethora of ways in which people who have incited violence or incited hatred,
or even written books,
or indeed written books, can be brought to court. There's been nothing like that. So I think it's completely astonishing that we're in a kind of maelstrom of media and, I'm afraid to say, parliamentary hatred being poured out against this person who, as everybody knows, if you haven't been charged and you haven't been tried, you remain innocent.
What's really interesting is that what's missing in Abu Qatada's case is actually Abu Qatada's voice. We've not heard it at all in the past 10 years, and other than two times. And one was when he called for the release of hostage Norman Kember, who, to repay the favour after he was released, became a surety in Abu Qatada's case for him to be released. And the other was in the BBC journalist Alan Johnston, who was held in Palestine, and Abu Qatada also called for his release. What is it about Abu Qatada that makes his voice almost unpalatable? Nobody even wants to hear what he has to say or give him a platform to defend himself.
Well, he's not allowed to make any statements from prison, except on those two occasions on which it suited the British government and the British security services to do something to try to save a British national. And they called on him for help on those two occasions, and he gave it. But part of the reason that he's been held under either control orders or in prisons is precisely so that people cannot hear his voice and make judgments about him. And it reminds me very much of what used to be done with the Irish. If you remember, there was a time, which seems extraordinary when we think of it now, when Irish politicians' voices were said by actors because it was somehow dangerous
Jerry Adams,
to hear
you speak
the
of.
actual Jerry Adams. How weird is that?
Well, I mean, this is, of course, the British government did try to have some type of discussions with Abu Qatada, I think, prior to the September 11 attacks. And one of the people who attempted to discuss this issue, as you know, between the intelligence service and Abu Qatada was Bishar Rawi. And we know what happened to him. He was sent to Guantanamo for his efforts. Abu Qatada's case goes back a very long time to something that's really controversial. And you've lived in Algeria, and that's where what happened in Algeria became so central to Abu Qatada. Can you just give me an idea as to the Algeria that you saw and what was coming around by the time Abu Qatada started talking about it?
Okay, well, when I lived in Algeria, it was a military dictatorship, and it was before they had the elections which the Islamist party, the FIS, was likely to win. And when they almost won, the elections were quickly cancelled. And subsequently to that, in the 1990s, Algeria saw an absolutely brutal and frightening civil war in which many factions fought against each other and against the government. Now, in the centre of that is supposedly a fatwa in which Abu Qatada supported one of the most brutal of those factions, who specialised in atrocities in rural areas against country people, families, including women and children.
The GIA you speak of.
The GIA. Now,
the armed Islamic group.
I have read on the internet many versions of what Abu Qatada is supposed to have said, and many serious scholars of this have told me that this is why they never wanted to associate with Abu Qatada. But I don't read Arabic, so I have not read the original fatwa. Perhaps you have.
I have read the fatwa, and he, of course, he quotes Ibn Taymiyyah, a 12th century, 13th century Islamic scholar, in relation to a situation where Muslim women and children, or the enemies are killing Muslim women and children. He responds by saying that it is okay to threaten, not to do the action, to threaten to reciprocate. And this has now, I believe, been touted as Abu Qatada's fatwa to blatantly kill women and children. But of course, it's known that when the GIA had gone too far completely, he issued a statement against them and distanced himself from them. But why hasn't that, do you think, why hasn't that come out?
Well, I'm afraid I think Abu Qatada has become a kind of useful myth figure, if you like, for not just the security services, but also British governments and American governments who have needed, since 9/11, they have needed Muslim figures to symbolize how frightening the world is out there. And that kind of validates their cutting all these corners, the illegalities of Guantanamo and all the other things that the Americans have done and the British have been complicit in. And earlier on you mentioned Bishr al-Rawi. Now when Bishr was in Guantanamo, one of the things that he was constantly asked about in his zillions of interrogations was Abu Qatada. What conversations did you have with Abu Qatada? Tell us about Abu Qatada. And he's not the only person who, this obsession of the Americans about Abu Qatada, and I think that that has played into a vision of him that has been created in this country by the media.
And just to explain, I mean, this was two individuals from Britain, Jamil al-Banna, Bishr al-Rawi, who'd gone on a business trip to Gambia. They had been interrogated by the intelligence services before they'd gone there, and of course they were handed over then to the Americans and sent to Bagram, of course, which is where I first saw them. It's bizarre that Abu Qatada, after 10 years, I remember when I returned from Guantanamo, I didn't know what had taken place in the UK, but almost the day that I returned, there was a judgment by the House of Lords to say that the detention of certain individuals in the UK was going to be deemed to be unconstitutional, and one of those men whose detention was taking place was Abu Qatada. He was released after that, but then something else happened.
Well, he was released on a control order. Then after 7/7, along with a lot of those other men, many of whom were Algerians, they were swooped up again. And again, they went through this process in which they were deemed to be, as it said, a threat to Britain. But none of them were ever interrogated. None of them, while people in Guantanamo were being interrogated about Abu Qatada, he was never being interrogated. He was just put away in a corner and kind of, you know, anybody stopped from listening to his sermons or listening to his words or knowing anything about him.
So there you go. You have Abu Qatada detained in the UK. We're told by everybody that's in power, including intelligence services and those who feed information to those that are in power, that he is an extremely dangerous individual. Well then, why isn't he questioned by the security services, and why isn't he questioned by the police?
Well, I think my answer that it's been convenient for some people to have a kind of bogey figure, and there have been many of them in our society. It's one of the things we specialise in. But if they had any chance of putting him in prison on a charge and trying him in court, of course they would have done it over this whole period. And that's why I feel that the current media onslaught against him, which is so humiliating him in every paper, really degrades my profession. Because all you ever hear about him is shock horror. In the Hamburg flat of some of the 9/11 bombers, there were some of his sermons on CDs. So is that, what kind of a crime is that?
It also says that they found some money in his house which had been labelled for the Mujahideen of Chechnya. Is that a crime, or was that a crime at the time? So there are all these sorts of things, and if they were crimes, surely the greatest crime that Abu Qatada would have committed would have been the one that purportedly supported the killing of women and children in Algeria. But has Algeria ever sought his extradition?
No.
Or even charged him with a crime?
No, no.
And so here's the great elephant in the room then, isn't it? Is that Abu Qatada is said to be this greatly dangerous man, and the worst thing that he's supposed to have done, nobody's even holding him to account for it.
Well, nobody's held him account except in the media for any of the things that he has supposedly done. And I think it's shocking that even a paper like The Guardian, for instance, repeats these cliches about him. The right-hand man of bin Laden, the question of the tapes in Hamburg. All of this is it's just hearsay and rubbish, and people should look at it in a much, much cooler manner.
Interestingly, the man, Judge Balthazar Garzon, who said that Abu Qatada is the right-hand man of bin Laden, was today convicted for perverting the cause of justice. I mean, that's just as a sideline. But surely our country, the Americans and everybody else, in the greater picture, must realize that what began all of this, you said you were in Algeria, and there was a democratic election that took place. The election was cancelled, an Islamic Party was due to win. And then war broke out because there was no other way for people to express themselves and to assert themselves. What has now taken place 10 years later in the Arab Spring is precisely that. And the only reason why Algeria hasn't joined it is because it's had this terrible experience of butchery. That none of the Western nations ever said that let us support the elections in Algeria. But now, in the light of what's taking place in Syria, which is right next door to Jordan, the place they want to extradite Abu Qatada back to, what's going to happen? Do they seriously think that there's not going to be change in those countries either?
Well, I mean, Western foreign policy has a long record of getting things wrong and being really behind the curve. I mean, if you think of the whole end of colonialism, the last people who saw colonialism ending was people in the capitals of France, Britain, Portugal. They fought against the end of colonialism. It's the same sort of thing now. You know, look at all the photographs you can see of Tony Blair staying in the villa of Mubarak or hugging Colonel Gaddafi on the tarmac. This was practically yesterday. And then all of a sudden, when those people are being overthrown by their old things, we in Britain quickly change sides.
This is a really important point you made, because one of the things that we know that Britain did under Tony Blair was to sign, or to attempt to sign, memoranda of understanding with countries known to practice torture, that if individuals are returned to those countries, that they will not somehow torture them or arbitrarily detain them. We have attempted to do that with Jordan also. and knowing our track record, knowing what's happened in Libya, that we've got rendition victims who are now helping to run the country, but also having cases against the British intelligence services, the government, are we seriously thinking now that these same memoranda of understanding are going to be worth the paper they're written on?
Well, in the case of Libya, of course, the memorandum of understanding didn't stand up. And the Libyans who were here as exiles and were under control orders, suddenly they all got freed because everybody agreed the memorandum of understanding was, as you say, not worth the paper it was written on. But in the case of Jordan, although here a lot of lawyers think that the MOU is worthless, one of the things that happened in the European Court of Human Rights last month in the Abu Qatada case was that the court ruled that the memorandum of understanding was good enough. So the whole issue of why he didn't go back was nothing to do with the idea that he might be tortured. The ruling was very narrow. It was a question of that the evidence against him had been got by torture.
Abu Qatada came to this country in 1993. He's a Palestinian. He's from Bethlehem. And surely that diaspora that he's a part of is part of his sort of legacy of where he's come from. You've been very involved in the Palestinian issues. What do you think in relation to the population that's in Jordan and the movement of people that's been taking place over the years? Will Abu Qatada, if he's sent back there, will he be able to fit back in? Will he be thrown into prison? Will things change there in light of the Arab Spring, or is it, do we just not know at all?
Into Palestine, you mean?
Well, Jordan, but...
If he's sent back to Jordan, well, as we know, just this week, David Cameron is trying to make some private arrangement with the King of Jordan, in which Abu Qatada will somehow go back to Jordan and have some kind of a trial in which this particular evidence will not be used. And I think the British government are doing everything they can to find a way around that European Human Rights Court's ruling. I just couldn't possibly begin to say how he would be treated in Jordan. But I think I could say that in Palestine, if let's just have a free-rolling moment forward when the occupation is ended and there is a Palestine, you know, 3/4 of the men in Palestine have served long, long prison sentences. Prison is part of everybody's experience. You're not special if you've had a long prison sentence.
Right.
And you just accept it. It's just part of the whole...
Well, I mean, this is fantastic, because don't we take the lesson of South Africa? We look at Nelson Mandela, the most famous man, the most respected man on the planet, as a convicted terrorist, and became president. We've seen, and I've met people in Tunisia, for example, part of the Nada party, individuals who were detained and held for 16 years, another man who was convicted for 68 years, and all of these people were released and now part of the leadership, as indeed they are in Libya and in Egypt. Surely somebody in power must be seeing the winds of change that are coming along. There's got to be somebody there who says, well, Abu Qatada isn't somebody we should be demonizing. We should have been talking to him a long, long time ago, because somebody like him at some point will probably, based on what we've seen around the world, come into a very, very influential position in these countries. Do you think there's anybody like that?
Well, I don't know anybody in the Tory party, and I've never heard anybody talking like that. But I think one of the very interesting parallels to that is in the case where Theresa May wanted to exclude from this country Sheikh Riyad from Jerusalem. In the case in which he said why was he not conducive, one of the witness statements in favor of him was written by Professor Noam Chomsky from Boston, in which he said precisely what you've said. He said, in my view, people in Britain should really be listening to Sheikh Riyad if they want to understand anything about the dynamics of the Palestinian situation. And I think that's absolutely right. And that's why Sheikh Riyad has spent 6 months here trying to clear his name as somebody who is so-called not conducive to the British good. And I think it would be exactly the same with Abu Qatada. And interestingly, of course, the British security services were very interested in talking to Abu Qatada before, but in the hysteria and Islamophobia and the general panic that took on Western intelligence services after 9/11, he became, I'm afraid, a very much pumped up demon figure that has become a kind of convenient fear creator. And I think that I just wish that our media and some of our politicians would speak clearly about this, so that people would not be led into feeling that somehow the streets of Britain will be terrified if he is taking his son to school. This is absolute nonsense.
Ignorance is bliss. You'd expect that from ordinary people, but not from the media. Thank you very much, Victoria. Well, that's all we've got time for this week. We'll continue to follow Abu Qatada's case as it progresses. Thank you, Victoria, for joining us, and to you at home for watching. Until next time, goodbye and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.